Oh, wow. All right. We are in the last section of the Vue Essentials in the new Vue.js.org documentation. So far, so good. We are in the component basics section. Let's see what this is about. Components allow us to split the UI into independent and reusable pieces. And think about each piece in isolation. It's common for an app to be organized into a tree of nested components. So we have a root and then three children, header, main, aside, and inside the main and the aside we have further components. This is very similar to how we nest native HTML elements, but Vue implements its own component model that allow us to encapsulate custom content and logic in each component. Vue also plays nicely with native web components. If you are curious about the relationship between Vue components and native web components, read more here. Defining a component. When using a build step, we typically define each Vue component in a dedicated file using the .vue extension, known as single file component. That would be an example of a Vue file with a script and a template. When not using a build step, a Vue component can be defined as plain JavaScript object containing Vue-specific options. We import, this is a plain JavaScript file. We import ref from Vue, and then we export default with a setup hook or a setup property, or a method to be more explicit, and a template property which contains our template. That's pretty much the same except object notation. This is much more convenient because we can have easier syntax highlighting, but this is also a possibility. Plain JS files. The template is inlined as a JavaScript string here, which Vue will compile on the fly. You can also use an ID selector pointing to an element, usually native template elements. Vue will use its content as the template source. The example above defines a single component and exports it as the default export of a JS file, but you can use named exports to export multiple components from the same file. Using a component, we will be using SFC syntax for the rest of this guide. The concepts around components are the same regardless of whether you are using a build step or not. The example section shows components usage in both scenarios. To use a child component, we need to import it in the parent component. Assuming we placed our counter component inside a file called button counter view, the component will be exposed as the file's default export. So we import it and then we use it. With script setup, imported components are automatically made available to the template. It's also possible to globally register a component, making it available to all components in a given app without having to import it. We have seen this before at the introduction or very early on. The pros and cons of global versus local registration is discussed in the dedicated component registration section. Components can be reused as many times as you want. So just to make things clear, we have an app here which imports button counter. This button counter has a ref, a count, and a button with a click and the text, and the app puts the button counter 3 times, and each button counter has its own independent state, decoupled from the others. Notice that when clicking on the buttons, each one maintains its own separate count. That's because each time you see a component, a new instance of it is created. In SFCs, it's recommended to use Pascal case tag names for child components to differentiate from native HTML elements. Although native HTML tag names are case insensitive, Vue SFC is a compiled format, so we are able to use case-sensitive tag names in it. We are also able to use the closing tag to close a tag. If you are authoring your templates directly in a DOM, for example, as the content of a native template element, the template will be subject to the browser's native HTML parsing behavior. In such cases, you will need to use kebab case and explicit closing tags for components. All right. Passing props. If we are building a blog, we will likely need a component representing a blog post. We want all the blog posts to share the same visual layout, but with different content. Such a component won't be useful unless you can pass data to it, such as the title and content of the specific post we want to display. That's where props come in. Props are custom attributes you can register on a component. To pass a title to your blog post component, we must declare it in the list of props this component accepts using the define props macro. So here is how we define a prop title for the blog post, and we show it here. Define props is a compile time macro that is only available inside script setup and does not need to be explicitly imported. Alright, declare props are automatically exposed to the template. Define props also returns an object that contains all the props passed to the component so that we can access them in JavaScript if needed. Alright, so this returns an object and we can access the props in JavaScript like that. If you are not using script setup, props should be declared using the props option, and the props object will be passed to setup as the first argument. Yeah, if you are not using the script setup, you need to do this. And then pass in to the setup function the props as the first argument. And then you can access them like that. But you don't need to return them to make them accessible to the template. A component can have as many props as you like, and by default any value can be passed to any prop. Once a prop is registered, you can pass data to it as custom attribute like this. Easy peasy, like an attribute. In a typical app, however, you'll likely have an array of posts in your parent component, then want to render a component for each one using v-for. And then we pass in the title like this, which coming from each element of the posts array, which we access with the post, because we are iterating over this with a v-for, and so on. Notice how we can use vbind to pass dynamic props. This is especially useful when you don't know the exact content you are going to render ahead of time. That's all you need to know about props for now, but once you've finished reading this page and feel comfortable with its content, we recommend coming back later to read the full guide on props. Alright. We are not finished with this section, but we'll take a break here and we are going to continue hopefully tomorrow. Cheers.